I'm excited to introduce our first panel. Is advertising diversification still needed? This is obviously a very hot topic. There's been a lot of discussion about advertising diversification. First, when it came to kind of the high prices of Google and Facebook, and then, with the Facebook boycott. So there's a lot to discuss here. I'm going to have the panelists turn on their camera. This session is moderated by Farzana Nasser, partner at Chameleon Collective. All right, cameras are turning on, everything's working. Farzana, are you with us? Melissa, you're muted, just so you know. I see the mute there, so make sure you unmute that. And we just need to get Farzana on. And there she goes.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So my name is Farzana Nasser. I'm a partner at Chameleon Collective. And the topic for today's panel is advertising diversification still needed? So this panel will explore whether advertising diversification is still critical for brands post-pandemic, and how the boycott Facebook movement may change the media landscape. And we have an awesome group of panelists here today, so I'd like to give them all an opportunity to introduce themselves with name, title, and if you could share a little bit about your respective businesses as well, that would be great. Melissa, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, so I'm Melissa. I lead product at PebblePost. PebblePost is a digital to direct mail platform that uses online intent to influence and power direct mail campaigns for brands.
Great. Matt?
Hey, I'm Matt Gehring, SVP of Growth at Rothy's. Rothy's, we transform sustainable materials into timeless shoes, accessories, other items.
And we have Emily next.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm the VP of Marketing Acquisition at Hims and Hers, and we are bringing healthcare to the masses. We're a digital health platform.
And Webb.
Hello, Webb Smith here, founder of 2PM Incorporated. We are a B2B media company for the e-commerce industry and a direct-to-consumer brand holding company. I'm also the former, the co-founder of Mizzen & Main.
Fantastic. So let's dive right in. We're really in a pretty interesting situation right now, given the COVID-19 pandemic. Advertisers have found Facebook and Google becoming a lot more efficient when you have entire industries that have pulled out of those platforms, like the travel industry and the entertainment industry. And then at the same time, there's been a lot of concerns about brand safety on some of these platforms, given the boycott Facebook movement. From your perspective, I think it'd be great to hear what you guys are seeing on your end and how you feel about diversification as a whole. Do you think that it is become more important, less important, or is it equally just as important as it was at the start of this year?
Yeah, I'd say equally important. It's kind of always important.
How about you, Emily?
Yeah, absolutely. Equally as important. It's always important to, finding scale, diversifying your customer mix, being prepared for geopolitical events that might change the landscape of your media mix.
Melissa, what do you think?
Yeah, similar to Emily, I think it's always important. Consumer behaviors are changing, and that's so evident now. So I feel like diversification can just adapt and evolve as behaviors change.
And Webb, what are you seeing on your end?
I think that they all said it really well. I would just like to emphasize that, as customer acquisition costs continue to fall off thanks to major advertisers pulling out, it's probably urgent that direct-to-consumer brands really take advantage of that while they can.
Great. Yeah, it sounds like this is the reality. It's here to stay, and marketers have to figure out how to embrace it. And so the question then becomes, how do you diversify? How do you balance this tension between, scaling these tried and true channels and experimentation and testing on new channels? And where do you start for brands that are early on in the stage? What channel should they be looking at? How should they be thinking about investing? And how do they balance this from a media mix perspective as far as how they're investing their dollars and their budgets? Matt, what are your thoughts on, broadly speaking, like, what are the types of channels that advertisers should be thinking about? How do you balance this testing and experimentation dichotomy versus, doing what is going to work at the onset?
Yeah, so it's a little bit to what Emily had first said. You are always testing, you're always looking at new opportunities. And I think for me, it really should start with where are your customers. how can you get in front of them? And kind of what Webb noted, where are the opportunities from a cost perspective? So what are the channels that, because of the dynamic shifts that we're dealing with right now, people are at home more, they're potentially listening to podcasts more, they're maybe interacting with direct mail more than they normally would. So understanding what's happening with those dynamics, and then can you efficiently get in front of them? But for me, it's always been, you build out your core channels. For a lot of us, it was built off of Facebook. That's where a lot of DTC brands seem to kind of start, and then you supplement with other ones. And you always want to have this kind of testing mentality and trying new channels to make sure that you remain diverse.
Great. Emily, would you agree with that? Are there certain channels that you're experimenting with right now that you want to talk about?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, I would add to Matt, we're always thinking about, where are we going to find efficiency during a given time, but we're also always looking to explore new opportunity. And so we get comfortable with about a 20% of our media spend going to test channels to really understand, is there opportunity in that space, and what can we learn? And so it allows us to maintain efficiency on our core mix, but gives us some buffer so we can explore. During this time, we've seen a lot of efficiency on the Facebook side. We've also seen a lot of efficiency on the TV side. I'd say it's very much varying week to week. And so we're being very nimble in how we choose to spend our dollars as we review results and enter the next week.
That's great. So you're optimizing your spend on a weekly basis based on how you're spending by channel?
Yeah, right now we are trying to optimize on a weekly basis where we can. There's definitely channels where that's harder to do. More of your kind of offline TV audio channels require more time. It also depends on how much you're spending in order to see kind of statistically significant results that you want to optimize on. And so we try to go into these shorter time periods during this time because every week is so different, but it does vary.
Melissa, I'm curious, Matt mentioned, consumer behavior changing and direct mail maybe being a channel that more brands are starting to consider as a result of that. Are you seeing that uptick on your end?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, direct mail has been a proven tactic to engage with consumers at home, and we believe wholeheartedly in that, especially now where we're all at home in this pandemic era, but also home is where the decisions are being made. So it's just really important that you find different touch points and new ways to engage with consumers directly at home.
That's great. And, in addition to looking at the media mix, in isolation of the company, we start to think about the stage of the company and where it makes sense to invest based on, early stage versus later stage companies. But I know you've seen kind of the whole gamut of like very early seed stage companies to actually working at much larger brands as well. What are your thoughts on how that media mix should change depending on company stage?
Yeah, I think that Matt pointed out a great point earlier. It's all about finding the arbitrage opportunities, especially when you're an earlier brand, and even more especially when you may not have like the funding levels of larger brands. So, whether it's programmatic TV ads right now, I know that's gearing up, or again taking advantage of Facebook spend now that a lot of the major advertisers have dropped out. I think there are ways to sort of build momentum around specific verticals of ad spend.
Emily, you and I had a great conversation around thinking about not just company stage, but product type. So within HIMS, there's multiple different product types, and thinking about the media mix based on the product as well and the consumer for each product. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are launching a lot of products, in any given month, and we have different goals for those products. The products might be something that are intended to nurture our current base and provide, more access to them, and other products that are more to bring in an entirely new customer to our platform. And so we, start there in understanding what is the right kind of own versus paid channel mix we want to have. We also look at our margins on those products to understand what kind of marketing we can support as we're going in and learning how to even begin to message and what kind of channels are resonating with customers. We have to assess that margin to understand the risks that we want to take on for our business. Every product we launch has a different set of competitors, a different kind of customer type that is interested, and the kind of message that we need to share in order to get someone interested in our platform. And so it will very much vary what media mix we use for each product to accommodate those goals.
That makes a lot of sense. Matt, at Rothy's, are you thinking about it from a product perspective, or is the consumer the same across most product lines?
It does vary. I mean, it's really similar to what Emily said. We don't have as wide range of product portfolio as they do, but it does look at who's going to buy our lace-up sneaker that we just launched this last week. How is she different from our point flat buyer that we originally started the brand with, 4+ years ago? So we're looking at, when we launch products, how it relates to our customer base. And then we're thinking about what's the right channel to introduce that customer to the product. And overall, like what Emily talked about with margin, I mean, that's really key. And I think that overall that really drives how we think about the media mix at really most companies around what's that overall business goal? And how do you think about customer acquisition? Are you willing to acquire a customer at a loss? Are you looking at some kind of payback period versus are you trying to operate profitably with every order? But the mix and where that channel kind of comes into play in terms of driving that order is also sort of another factor you need to think through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great segue to KPIs and measurement. As you're thinking about the media mix and what your goals are, how do you actually create KPIs that make sense? How do you measure it? What are you thinking about as far as, figuring out incrementality and things like that? Melissa, do you have thoughts on that as it relates to direct mail specifically and how you're actually setting KPIs for campaigns for your clients?
Yeah, definitely. So we wholeheartedly believe in incrementality and lift measurement, especially for our channel that kind of straddles digital and direct mail. It's really important to help brands understand incremental impact that programmatic direct mail can have on their KPIs, but also how we fit in a larger media mix. So we really lean on incrementality, but we also always have an ROI or laser focus on getting ROI for our brands. So.
Great. Emily, are you focused on, are you looking at incrementality? Are you looking at ROI? Are there multiple different measurements you're looking at depending on the channel? How are you thinking through those things?
Yeah, we look at everything. And so we have CAC LTV targets for each product, and we're, figuring out what ratio is right for each channel depending on the customer coming in. We see some channels have much stronger LTV than others. And so it actually gives us, more of an ability to go test and do more broad top of funnel marketing that is harder to measure. We're spending a lot of time doing modeling to get very sophisticated on our offline channels. We do a lot of regression modeling, pre versus post on TV and audio to really assess the impact there. We're doing a lot of couponing and how did you hear about us surveys as well to, really bridge the gap where we're not able to model us perfectly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, measurement continues to be one of those elusive things that everyone is still figuring out in a real-time basis. Webb, from your perspective, when you look at companies from an investor perspective, are there certain metrics that you're looking at as far as how they're spending their dollars to provide value?
I think I look at it holistically. So I tend to try to, this is specific to me. So I tend to try to look for direct-to-consumer brands that have raised small sums of money that also have great organic growth through their own channels. So whether they control their own media or they have built communities around their products, those are early indicators that if they do raise larger sums of venture capital, then they're going to be able to achieve profitability through paid or otherwise, paid marketing channels or otherwise, in the not too distant future.
Got it. That makes sense. And Matt, on your end, how are you measuring by channel?
It is, so the KPIs, it's really similar to what Emily talked about, but it's channel specific. And the other factor that we look at is sort of the purpose of that channel. So is it more of a higher funnel awareness building? So we think of, say, something like Pinterest that we view as more upper funnel, a great way to introduce people to our brand. We're still going to measure a CAC or CPA around that, but we're also going to pull in broader kind of awareness-based measurements understanding what it's doing with our aided and unaided awareness, understanding how that flows into other channels. And so having MTA and MMM, so multi-touch attribution or media mix models that help you figure out where to direct that spend in order to achieve that kind of channel specific goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Emily, you mentioned that there's a number of channels that are more difficult to measure. And so thinking about ways around basically creating that bridge to figure out how to measure those harder to measure channels like podcasts, like OTT, out of home. Can you talk a little bit more about the tactics that you're using to bridge that?
Yeah, all these spaces are getting a lot smarter. And so, it's exciting to kind of test and learn with them. Podcasts, there's a lot of different things and new things that we do. We just started pixeling, which is super exciting. So we can understand, the audience listening, are they then coming back to our site? We're still doing How Did You Hear About Us surveys to really understand that kind of multiplier we want to apply as well. Offline, billboards in cities we buy a lot of, and it's probably one of the most difficult to measure. We're doing, enough of a kind of local takeover that we can assess lift in those markets. And we're comparing those markets to similar markets as a baseline and to assess seasonality to see what is the true lift in those markets. So not a perfect science, but really helps us get, closer to understanding the impact there. TV and audio, we also do a lot of dark periods, so we can assess, business baselines and then the incrementality when we are to go back live on those programs.
Matt, I know you do a lot of testing on these channels as well. Would you say that you're using similar approaches to this?
Yeah, very, very similar. The How Did You Hear About Us survey is important. Doing the kind of geo holdouts where you find cities with similar penetration, similar dynamics, and then see how those kind of, it's a way, you're doing a little bit of a kind of incrementality testing with it, but very, very similar approach. And a lot of it is kind of triangulating all of the different data points that you're getting, looking in platform, looking what your site sees, looking what your attribution tool sees, those types of elements.
Okay, great. This is a nice segue into traditional media and the role that traditional media as a whole plays in the media mix. Melissa, from a direct mail perspective, what's your perspective on what the role for direct mail is specifically?
Yeah, so direct mail is a proven tactic that really has its place in the marketing mix for breaking through the noise and the clutter, especially in today's world with digital and email being so cluttered, and having that direct engagement with the consumer at home, which I mentioned earlier was kind of where the decisions are being made. But from our perspective at PebblePost, we have now realized the impact of that tangible physical mail and have kind of amplified it by using that digital intent to power and influence that direct mail to make sure it's relevant to the consumer, because that ultimately performs for brands. So how we view it.
And Matt, what's your experience with direct mail?
Use it a lot of different places. For me, again, I kind of go back to that whole, how do I meet her for Rothy's, meet her or meet our customer in a different way, and how does it drive incrementality? Like it's, how do you capture different demand? How do you kind of push a narrative along? How do you introduce new products? So it can be a really good resource, both from prospecting as well as from re-engagement, getting your base to come back and buy again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's another interesting segue to how you actually balance out that media mix from a prospecting perspective versus a retargeting perspective. Webb, I know you've worked with a number of companies in this space that are trying to do some interesting things mid and bottom funnel. What's your perspective on the value of retargeting and the focus for that?
I think that I have a tremendous respect for the retargeting processes. Listen, I think that with the brands that I work with, I think that finding ways to achieve more organic top funnel growth so that you're spending more at mid or lower funnel, I think is something that you're seeing again with the much younger brands. As you get to the levels of Rothy's and Hims and Hers, obviously they have a lot more sophistication and a greater ability to track at that top of funnel. But for the younger brands, I think that there's definitely a trend towards partnerships and media influencer buys that are cheaper top of funnel, so that they're spending more mid funnel for trackable retargeting.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Emily, do you have any thoughts on the retargeting side of the equation?
Yeah, so we, have different kinds of marketing for, targeting different pieces of the funnel. For us, in the kind of classic retargeting sense, we actually don't do so much with kind of pixeling and retargeting customers that come into our flow, because we are HIPAA compliant. And so we get very creative with the kinds of targeting to try to hit people that we believe already have come to the site or are aware of the brand, but aren't maybe as robust as someone like Matt, who has less complications when it comes to pixeling.
Mm-hmm. Matt, would you agree with that? Less complications for you?
I'm glad I don't have Emily's complications around HIPAA compliance. But it's really looking at, is this customer who already exists, and I guess we break apart retargeting both from a new and existing perspective. So, but is she going to come back and buy again? Do we need to get another ad in front of her? And then thinking about some of the offline channels like TV, out of home, the podcast, where you're not as easily able to exclude customers. Whereas Facebook, we can make sure that we're not hitting our existing customers, those types of things. So you look at that and you look at measurement around the orders between new and existing when you spin those channels up, and how it impacts kind of new versus repeat visitors. So it definitely plays into the media mix. And I think it's kind of how you look through that flow of getting that person aware of your brand, getting them to think about visiting the site, and then qualifying that traffic and getting, spending the right amount of money to get them to come back and buy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes a lot of sense, thinking about the whole life cycle. Melissa, How do you guys approach that from a retargeting perspective?
Yeah, so we've seen retargeting just be very powerfully important and performant for our brands, mainly because the consideration and the research all starts online. So we're able to really leverage that. But also there's a lot of, to Matt's earlier point, we also break it out between new and existing customers, and brands have a hard time understanding who these anonymous visitors are if you have no pre-existing relationship with them. So we're able to connect those online signals to household address, and then follow up with that tangible physical piece. That has been really highly performing in our brands.
That's great. Well, we have a couple minutes left, so let's wrap up with one final question before we close this up. Looking to the future, I think it'd be great to get your perspective on what areas of channel diversification will remain a strategic priority for brands over the long term. Like what are the things that brands should be focusing on when you have much more of a longer term horizon down the road? Emily, what are your thoughts on that looking forward?
Yeah, so I'm super excited about channel diversification. I think, COVID, what's been fun as a marketer is to see shifts in behavior of where consumer eyeballs are and how do you adapt to that. A couple things that get me really excited, Attentive is a sponsor of this today, and their platform is really incredible. Engagement through text message is really an exciting space. Content is also an exciting space. It's generally a free space to play in, and there's a lot of amazing ways to utilize it. Calm recently announced that they have a Netflix show coming out, and so people are doing some very unique and clever things to diversify their mix, and so lots of ways to play in it, even online.
That's great. Yeah, that's pretty innovative with a Netflix show and so many different opportunities to do things that are really different. Webb, what's your thoughts on this? What's the future here?
I actually am looking forward to seeing larger scale direct to consumer brands partner with existing media companies, whether through actual acquisition or joint venture. I think you're going to see a lot more of these media companies that are trying to extend their lifetime value, and the brands working with these companies that could help them to lower their cost of customer acquisition. So you're going to see more sort of lower level brands and independent media companies partnering with one another if not potentially acquiring one or the other in the coming months.
Interesting. Lots of consolidation in the industry, sounds like. Matt, how about you on your end? What are you thinking about for the future?
Definitely echo the content side that people mentioned, and just how product and brands start to weave themselves more into content we interact with at a daily basis. I mean, I think what I'm really looking for the most in the future is really better understanding of how channels interact, and across all those different touch points, from how channels interact from an awareness perspective, how they interact once you're starting to get people on your site, and then once they've made a purchase and you're trying to get them to come back. So some of the pixel improvements that have happened, like with podcasts now, being able to kind of tie a digital piece to sort of more of an offline event, or things like PebblePost is doing, where you're able to tie together somebody that visits your site and then drive that specifically with a direct mail piece, I think are this kind of cool merging of online and offline.
Great. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you so much, everyone.